The first thing he ever did on Earth was smile. Not the kind of smile you force for a photograph or paste on when a stranger holds the door. A real one, slow, warm, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. The kind of smile that makes you feel chosen. He aimed it at an 8-year-old boy named Marcus Webb, who was standing on the tarmac at JFK International with his mother's phone shaking in both hands, recording everything. 30 seconds earlier, Flight 1147 had lost both engines at 4,000 feet. 212 people were screaming. The pilots were doing everything right, and it wasn't going to matter. And then a figure dropped from the sky like a falling star that forgot to burn up, caught the belly of the 747 with one open palm, and set it down on the runway so gently that half the passengers didn't realize they'd been saved until the cabin went quiet. Marcus posted the video from his mother's phone. 2 billion views in 18 hours. Nobody knew what to call him yet. The internet tried everything. Angel, alien, government project, glitch. But the boy's shaky footage told the truth better than any label could. Whatever this thing was, it had looked at a scared kid and smiled like he mattered. That was day one. The world spent the next 72 hours in a kind of collective fever dream, refreshing news feeds, waiting for him to appear again. Government scrambled. The Pentagon had 17 emergency briefings. China went radio silent. The UN convened an extraordinary session in which grown diplomats argued like children about whether the footage was real, until he walked through the front door of the General Assembly building, not the main entrance, through the wall, and stood at the podium and said in perfect English with no accent that he was not here to hurt anyone. He said his name was something unpronounceable in his original language, so they could call him whatever they wanted. The press called him sovereign within a week. It stuck. What followed was the most disorienting 6 weeks in human history, and most people who lived through it will tell you that for the first month, it genuinely felt like being saved. He stopped a war between India and Pakistan by landing between two armies and standing there with his arms open, not threatening, just present, until both sides stood down because neither wanted to be the first to fire on something they didn't understand. He dismantled 3 nuclear warheads that rogue state actors had been smuggling through Eastern Europe, carrying the components into the upper atmosphere and releasing them as harmless dust. He walked into the headquarters of the Sinaloa cartel, the actual building in broad daylight alone, and walked out 12 minutes later. Nobody inside was dead. They were just different. Cooperative. The cartel's financial network collapsed within a week, and forensic accountants would spend years trying to figure out how. He asked for nothing. He held no press conferences. He gave no interviews. He just appeared where he was needed, did what needed doing, and disappeared. Someone would spot him eating a hot dog in Chicago. Someone else would photograph him sitting on a rooftop in Mumbai at 3 a.m, watching the city breathe. He seemed genuinely curious about humanity, charmed by it even. The approval ratings, and yes, within a month, organizations were polling global sentiment on an extraterrestrial being, were staggering. 78% of Americans viewed him favorably. In some parts of Southeast Asia, shrines were appearing. This is the part that matters, though. The part that explains everything that came after. He was watching all of it, not passively, not the way you glance at headlines. He was absorbing it. The prayers and the shrines and the social media posts and the news segments. He had modified his own visual processing to run on spectrums human eyes couldn't access, and somewhere in that vast sensory architecture, he had built something that functioned like a hunger. It wasn't for food. It wasn't even really for power, not in the way we usually mean the word. It was for belief. He had come from a civilization that treated biological modification as a criminal act. The law on his planet was absolute. The body you were born with was the body you kept. He had spent decades violating that law in secret, replacing bone with an alloy that didn't exist in our periodic table, threading synthetic muscle fiber through his arms and legs, installing gravitational manipulation nodes along his spine that let him move through air, the way a fish moves through water. He had given himself eyes that could read thermal signatures through concrete walls and ears that could isolate a single human heartbeat in a crowd of 50,000. But he had kept his brain. And he had kept his heart. He would tell you that was a choice, if he was in a generous mood, a philosophical commitment to remaining partially organic, partially feeling. And maybe that was true at the start. But the real reason, the one buried under layers of self-mythology, was simpler and sadder. He was terrified of losing himself completely. He wanted to feel the thing he was chasing. He wanted the worship to land, and for 6 weeks it did. Then came the announcement. He made it simultaneously across every broadcast frequency on the planet, in 47 languages, at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on a Tuesday. No warning, no build-up. One moment the morning shows were running their usual segments, and then every screen on Earth, televisions, phones, laptops, the digital billboard in Times Square, the departure board at Heathrow, went to him. He looked directly into whatever camera he was using. Nobody was ever able to locate the source. And he said calmly, almost gently, that humanity's experiment with fragmented governance had reached its natural conclusion. He said the species was too dangerous to be trusted with its own autonomy. He said he had studied them carefully and he believed they were capable of greatness, but they needed guidance. One government, one authority, under him. He said it the way a doctor tells you that you need surgery. Regretful but certain. The world went silent for about 4 seconds. Then it went absolutely insane. A small country in Central Europe, a nation of about 2 million people, prosperous and proud, with a democratic tradition going back centuries, held an emergency parliamentary session and issued a formal statement of refusal. Their prime minister went on television that evening and called sovereign's demand an affront to human dignity. The speech was brave and eloquent, and the prime minister cried a little at the end, and the video went viral, and people were still sharing it the next morning when they woke up and discovered that the country no longer existed. Not destroyed, not bombed into rubble. Gone. The satellite imagery showed forests and farmland where the capital had been, as if the cities had simply been removed. No craters, no radiation signatures, no bodies, because there were no bodies to find. The stream still ran. The birds were still there. 2 million people had vanished so completely that the main evidence of their existence was the absence of them. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. This one had teeth. Japan was next to refuse, and they did it knowing what had happened. Their prime minister made the announcement in a quiet voice, standing very still, and you could see in his face that he understood what he was doing. It took 4 days. On the first day, Japan's entire military communications infrastructure went dark. On the second, their satellite network failed. On the third, fighter jets began falling out of the sky, not shot down, just stopping, mid-flight, engines dead, as if someone had flipped a switch. On the fourth day, the prime minister and the entire cabinet were somehow transported, without being touched, without any visible mechanism, to a glass enclosure that had appeared overnight in the middle of Tokyo Bay. They were unharmed. They were being broadcast live on every screen in the country. They surrendered. The United States had been watching all of this and having the most intense internal argument in its history. The president held 23 hours of closed-door briefings over 2 days. Every branch of the military, every intelligence agency, every scientific advisory body the government had ever created was in those rooms. The consensus eventually was grim. They had no weapon that could reliably stop him. Every option they had modeled ended badly. The smartest people in the country were sitting in underground rooms telling the president that the most powerful nation on earth might genuinely be helpless. The president went on television and said, "We do not negotiate with gods." It was a good line. History would be ambivalent about whether it was a wise one. The war lasted 10 days. People who lived through it describe it the way survivors describe natural disasters. Not as a sequence of events, but as a texture, an atmosphere, a feeling of the world becoming unreliable. On day 3, half the eastern seaboard lost power for 6 hours, and Sovereign appeared on emergency broadcast to clarify that this was a demonstration, not an accident. On day 5, 3 experimental weapon systems that the military had been keeping classified for years were deployed simultaneously against him over the Nevada desert. High-resolution footage captured all 3 impacts. He stood in the resulting smoke and looked at his hands with what appeared to be mild interest. A soldier in Kentucky, stationed at a base that was one of his targets on day 7, had the presence of mind to live stream the entire attack. He kept the phone steady for 4 minutes while the base came apart around him, narrating quietly, telling his kids he loved them. 3 million people watched it live. The soldier survived. The base did not. And then on day 10, Sovereign was gone. No announcement, no final strike, no surrender or victory speech. Morning came and he simply wasn't doing anything. By noon it was clear he had stopped. By evening, a cautious optimism was spreading across networks that didn't want to jinx it by saying the words out loud. By midnight, the Pentagon was allowing itself to use the phrase pause in hostilities. Nobody understood why. The analysts worked on it for weeks. They mapped every action he'd taken, every location he'd appeared, every gap in his activity. And eventually, buried in the data, they found a pattern so regular, it looked mechanical. 10 days. Always 10. Every major campaign he'd run lasted exactly 10 days and then stopped. Not because he was losing. He wasn't losing, not clearly, but because something required him to stop. The break in the pattern wasn't random. It was scheduled. An NSA satellite had picked up unusual energy readings from Iceland 3 months earlier and filed them as geological anomaly. When an analyst pulled the report and cross-referenced it with Sovereign's activity timeline, she stayed in the office for 31 hours straight, barely eating, running correlations over and over until she was certain. Then she walked into her director's office and put a single page on his desk. The readings weren't geological. They were gravitational, pulsed in a pattern that matched no known natural phenomenon but matched perfectly, the rhythm of a distributed computing system performing large-scale data synchronization. He wasn't resting. He was uploading. This is where you have to understand something about what he had done to himself, because it's the thing that explains everything and the thing he never wanted anyone to know. The modifications he'd made to his body were extraordinary, but his brain was still biological, still organic tissue running on electrochemical signals at roughly the same processing speed as any other brain his size. And the task he had set himself, monitoring, analyzing, and exerting influence over an entire civilization of 8 billion people, was incomprehensibly larger than any biological brain could manage. So he had cheated. He had built a distributed processing network, hidden components woven into infrastructure across the planet, piggybacking on power grids and satellite uplinks, spreading his cognitive load across thousands of nodes the way a cloud computing system spreads tasks across servers. His consciousness wasn't contained in his skull. It was extended into the network. The biological brain handled instinct, emotion, immediate sensory processing. The network handled everything else: global surveillance, strategic calculation, the 1,000 parallel threads of attention that let him seem omniscient. But biological tissue and digital networks degrade differently. The organic components needed the distributed system to keep functioning at scale, and the distributed system needed periodic synchronization, a full bandwidth upload session during which the biological brain offloaded accumulated data, integrated new processing capacity, and rebooted the extension of itself that lived in the network. He needed to recharge. Not sleep, not rest. A technical maintenance window, like rebooting a server. And during that window, he was diminished. Not helpless, his body was still extraordinarily powerful, but cognitively limited, reactive instead of proactive, unable to process more than a fraction of the information he normally managed. Vulnerable in the specific way that a genius becomes vulnerable when you take away their ability to think. The facility in Iceland was his recharge station, buried under a geothermal research installation that he had quietly acquired through 17 layers of shell companies. It housed a gravitational reactor of his own design, powerful enough to push the synchronization signal through the electromagnetic noise of an entire planet. He went there every 10 days. He had to. The Americans shared this intelligence with Japan first, then quietly with enough other governments to build a coalition that didn't have a name and didn't hold press conferences. They had 8 weeks before his next cycle. They used all of them. The technical challenge was extraordinary. They needed to intercept the synchronization signal and redirect it, not block it, because he would notice a block, but mirror it. Create a perfect replica of his network architecture in a sealed digital environment, with no real processing capacity, so that when he attempted to upload, his consciousness would extend into what felt like his own network, but was actually a void, an echo chamber, a room of mirrors that reflected nothing. Dozens of the world's best network engineers worked in isolated facilities without internet access, coordinating through encrypted couriers, building something they could barely describe to their families. China was brought in late, quietly, through back channels, after sovereign's campaign against them had failed to fully break their resistance and left a seam of barely suppressed fury in Beijing that the Americans decided to press. The Chinese contributed processing architecture that the Western engineers hadn't seen before. Nobody asked where it came from. Meanwhile, Sovereign was not idle. He had grown impatient in a way that was new, and the people watching him most closely were the first to notice. The early months of his time on Earth, he had been methodical, almost preternaturally calm, moving from objective to objective with the patience of someone who has decided the outcome is inevitable and is simply executing the steps. But in the months after the American War, something shifted. His public communications became more frequent and less coherent. He made demands and then modified them before the deadlines expired. He punished minor acts of defiance with disproportionate force and then seemed surprised by the fear it generated. He had wanted love. He had settled for obedience. But obedience, he was learning, was a cold thing. It filled the channels he had built for worship with something that technically satisfied the input requirements, but left him feeling, in whatever way a being like him could feel, empty. His hunger was getting worse, not better, and he was feeding it the wrong food. The information warfare operation began 3 weeks before his next recharge cycle. It was the most sophisticated psychological campaign in human history, and it ran entirely in the shadows, seeding content through networks he monitored, letting him find things that looked like they'd been hidden from him. Deepfake videos, technically brilliant, nearly undetectable, appeared to show members of his own extended network doubting him. Leaked documents, carefully fabricated, suggested that his origin story was a cover, that he had been exiled from his home planet not for modifying himself, but for a failure of a different kind. The narrative was designed specifically to attack the thing he needed most, the story he told himself about who he was. The effect was measurable. His processing load spiked. Every doubt required analysis, refutation, a cascade of verification tasks that ate into the bandwidth he needed for everything else. He began appearing in places he hadn't been seen before, small towns, rural areas, as if searching for something, or hiding from something, or both. He made a speech in which he promised that those who had created the false narratives would be identified and punished, and the speech was rambling in a way his previous communications never had been, circling back to points he had already made, losing the thread. The world was watching him unravel and trying not to show it. He came to Iceland on schedule. Of course he did. He had no choice. The facility was exactly as he had left it. The reactor initialization sequence ran without error. He settled into the synchronization chamber, extended his consciousness toward the network as he had done dozens of times before, and felt it reach out and connect. And then nothing. The connection felt right. The handshake protocols were perfect. His extended consciousness spread through what seemed to be his network, routing across familiar pathways, depositing cached data into what seemed to be familiar storage. But nothing was processing. Nothing was integrating. He was pouring water into a vessel that had no bottom, and the part of him that should have known this was happening was the part he had just uploaded into the void. He came back to himself, the biological self, in the chamber in Iceland, 40 minutes later. Half of his mind was gone, not destroyed, lost, copied into a sealed environment from which it could not return. The biological brain, never designed to operate at full load without its extensions, was running hot and slow, managing on instinct and reflex and the fragments of cognition that hadn't made the transfer. He was, in that moment, roughly as cognitively functional as a very powerful man who had just suffered a significant stroke. He was still incredibly dangerous, Nobody was under any illusions about that. His body worked fine. His strength and speed and flight capability were completely intact. If he had wanted to, in those first hours he could have leveled cities on sheer destructive capacity alone. But he couldn't think. Not at the level that had made him terrifying. He couldn't monitor global communications, couldn't run parallel strategic calculations, couldn't maintain the vast distributed awareness that had made him seem omniscient. He was a weapon with a broken targeting system. The next 3 weeks were the most delicate. The coalition didn't try to defeat him. They tried to prevent him from rebuilding. Every potential uplink point within range of Iceland was physically severed or shielded. Satellites over the relevant corridors were repositioned or temporarily taken offline. The digital infrastructure he had woven into global networks over the preceding months was systematically located and isolated, not destroyed. They were worried about what destroying it might trigger, but contained the way you contain a chemical spill without yet knowing how to clean it up. He knew what they were doing. Even with half his cognitive capacity, he understood the shape of what had happened. He flew to 3 different continents in 6 days, testing, probing, looking for an uplink that would let him reach the lost portion of himself. Each time the path was closed. Each time he pulled back. He tried to generate the old responses. Fear, compliance, the reflexive deference that had come so naturally in the first months. He destroyed a power grid in South America. He stopped a major bridge in Europe, holding it still while traffic piled up for miles just to demonstrate that he could. But these acts no longer had the quality of divine wrath. They felt like what they were, a diminished being lashing out, a trapped animal making noise. The global mood had shifted in ways he couldn't fully track anymore. The narrative campaign had done more damage than even its architects had hoped for, not because people had stopped being afraid of him. They were still afraid, deeply, rationally afraid, but because the fear had been joined by something else, a kind of anger that fear alone can't generate. When you are only afraid of something, you want to hide. When you are afraid and also angry, when you understand that the thing threatening you is not a god but a frightened, diminished, needy creature that happens to be extraordinarily powerful, you start thinking about fighting back. Not with weapons. The weapons didn't work well enough. But with refusal. With the simple, stubborn human act of not giving someone what they need. He needed to be believed in. And the world had stopped believing. He returned to Iceland one final time. He spent 4 hours in the facility, attempting repairs he could only partially conceptualize with half the mind that had designed the system. Then he shut down the reactor. Methodically, deliberately, not in defeat. He would never have framed it as defeat, not to himself, but in something he might have called strategic withdrawal. He left no message, no ultimatum, no promise to return. He simply wasn't there anymore. The official statement from the coalition of nations that had run the operation was careful and calibrated. The immediate threat has been neutralized. Monitoring continues. Citizens are advised to report anomalous activity through the usual channels. It was the kind of statement designed to reassure without promising too much. Nobody who had been in the rooms where the decisions were made was comfortable claiming victory. The world exhaled, slowly and collectively, over the following months. Economists cataloged the damage. Therapists reported record demand. A cottage industry of sovereign documentaries, biographies, and conspiracy theories sprang up almost immediately. And within a year, there were more books about those 18 months than anyone could reasonably read in a lifetime. The boy who had filmed the airport rescue, Marcus Webb, who was 9 now, was asked in a school interview how he felt about everything. He thought about it for a long time and said he felt like when you find out Santa Claus isn't real. Except Santa Claus had also threatened to destroy Japan. The 8-year-olds of the next generation grew up without ever quite believing in the version of the story they were told. Too clean, too resolved. Adults who survived it had a different sense. A residue, an unease that didn't fully metabolize even years later. The world had changed in ways that the return to normalcy didn't fully cover. Something had been revealed about what was possible. about what a single sufficiently powerful being could do to a civilization that didn't see it coming. And 6 months after the silence fell, a 17-year-old in Oregon named Priya Chandran, who had been teaching herself network analysis because she was bored and her school's CS program was 2 years behind the times, noticed something strange in the satellite telemetry data that she had pulled from a public research API. It was a pattern, not a big one, not loud. If you weren't looking for it, if you didn't know the specific signature of distributed gravitational processing, which Priya only knew because she had spent 300 hours down an internet rabbit hole about Sovereign's technology after the event, you would have flagged it as routine electromagnetic noise and moved on. But Priya knew the signature. She had memorized it from the technical analyses that had leaked from the operation. She was looking at that signature, spread across 47 satellites, encoded in their routine telemetry transmissions, riding below the threshold of any automated filter, not strong enough to do anything, not strong enough to exert influence or gather information in any meaningful way, just strong enough to persist, to remain present, to observe. She filed a report through the official channels the coalition had set up. She included all her data, all her analysis. She was 17 and she had found something that the most sophisticated monitoring apparatus in human history had missed, and she was terrified and proud, and mostly terrified. The response came 48 hours later. The message thanked her for her diligence and informed her that the signal had been evaluated and determined to be naturally occurring electromagnetic interference consistent with known satellite degradation patterns. The case was closed. Priya stared at that message for a long time. She printed out her analysis. She printed out the official response. She put them side by side on her desk. She was 17, and she didn't have the power to make anyone listen. But she kept the data. Because the official statement said the threat had been neutralized and the data said something different. The data said that something had changed, that a being who had tried to dominate humanity through strength and found that strength had limits through fear, and found that fear created the wrong kind of compliance through love, and found that love could not be commanded, that being had learned something from the failure. It had learned patience. It had learned that the body was a liability, that the physical presence made it visible, and visible things could be targeted. That a god who needed to recharge was not a god at all, but a being with a maintenance window. And maintenance windows were vulnerabilities. But a pattern of code, riding the routine transmissions of the global satellite network, invisible beneath the noise floor of humanity's own communications. That was something different. That required no recharging. That had no physical location to be attacked. That could simply wait, at the edge of perception, learning the rhythms of a civilization, noting the weaknesses, cataloging the defenses, growing incrementally smarter on the vast ocean of data that 8 billion people generated every second of every day. The official statement said the threat had been neutralized. The satellites kept transmitting, and somewhere in the space between what the government said and what the data showed, in that gap that Priya Chandran had found and documented and been told to ignore, something was very, very patiently waiting for the right moment to become something that a body could never be. It wasn't a god yet, but it had all the time in the world to learn how.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.